A desperate act of mercy leads Miriam Blackwood to gamble her life on saving a wounded Comanche hunter, unaware that her choice will expose a deadly conspiracy targeting innocent settlers. When the man she healed becomes her unlikely ally against powerful enemies who want her silenced, will their fragile trust be enough to survive the storm of violence heading straight for her door? The scream that tore from Miriam's throat echoed across the empty Nebraska territory like a gunshot, but no one came running. No one ever came running anymore. Not since Henry died 6 months ago, leaving her alone with their unborn child and a cabin that felt bigger than the endless prairie surrounding it. The year was 1867, and autumn had painted the grasslands gold and brown, but Miriam saw only gray as she knelt beside the wooden cross that marked her husband's grave. Her swollen belly pressed against her knees, making the position painful, but she stayed anyway. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, as if it too felt the weight of their lonely world. "I don't know how to do this alone," she whispered to the weathered wood. The cross bore Henry's name in her careful writing, though the ink had started to fade like everything else good in her life. "I don't know how to raise a child when I can barely keep myself alive." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Something that made her stomach clench with worry. Smoke. Not the friendly smoke of a neighbor's chimney, but the sharp, bitter smell of burning grass. Prairie fires could race across the land faster than a horse could run, turning everything in their path to ash. She struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her aching back. The baby had grown heavy in recent weeks, and the doctor in town had warned her the birth would come soon. But there was no one to help her when the time came. No mother to hold her hand, no sister to boil water and tear sheets. Just Miriam and the endless sky and the fear that gnawed at her belly like hunger. The smoke grew thicker as she walked back toward the cabin, her boots crunching on the dried grass. Henry had built the cabin with his own hands, cutting each log and fitting each board with the patience of a man who believed in the future. The windows were small but clean, and the door was solid oak that could hold against wind and rain. But would it hold against fire? Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. The kitchen table where Henry used to read his Bible sat empty, his chair pushed in neat and proper like he might come back any moment. The bedroom where she slept alone now seemed too big, the bed too wide for one person. And the small room he'd been turning into a nursery remained half-finished, with tiny wooden toys he'd carved sitting on the windowsill like promises he couldn't keep. Miriam touched her belly and felt the baby move. Soon she would hold her child for the first time. Soon she would have to be strong enough for two. But looking around the quiet cabin, listening to the wind rattle the windows, she wondered if strength was something you could learn, or if some people were just born without enough of it. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and she realized the fire wasn't distant anymore. It was coming toward her land, toward the only home she'd ever known. And she was completely, terrifyingly alone. She grabbed the water bucket and hurried outside, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The horizon to the west glowed orange, and she could see the dark line of smoke climbing toward the stars. The fire was still miles away, but fires on the prairie could move as fast as the wind pushed them. She had maybe an hour before it reached her land, maybe less. Miriam had never fought a fire alone before. Henry had always been there, calm and steady, telling her what to do and when to do it. But Henry was gone, and the baby was coming soon, and the fire didn't care that she was scared and alone and didn't know how to save herself. She filled every bucket and pot she could find, soaking the ground around the cabin and the small vegetable garden Henry had planted. Her back screamed with each trip to the well, and the baby kicked harder with each passing minute, as if it knew danger was coming. But she kept working, kept filling buckets, kept hoping that somehow she could save the life she and Henry had built together. The fire crept closer, turning the western sky red as blood. And in that red glow, Miriam saw something that made her heart stop. Not just fire, but shapes moving in the smoke. Riders, men on horseback, silhouetted against the flames like demons from a nightmare. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin, her hands shaking as she reached for the rifle Henry had taught her to use. But as she lifted it, her swollen belly got in the way, and she knew with sinking certainty that she couldn't fight off multiple attackers in her condition. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she gasped at the sudden pain. The riders were getting closer, and she could hear their horses' hooves pounding against the dry earth. In the distance, the fire roared like a living thing, hungry and unstoppable. And somewhere between the approaching danger and her own helplessness, Miriam realized that tonight might be the night her child became an orphan before it was even born. But she was Henry's wife, and Henry had never backed down from a fight. So she gripped the rifle tighter, said a prayer to whatever God might be listening, and waited to see what kind of men rode through fire in the dead of night. Blood had a smell that cut through everything else, sharp and metallic like old pennies left in the rain. Miriam knew that smell well from her years helping women birth their babies, but she'd never expected to smell it at dawn while hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin. The groan that followed made her drop the wet sheet she'd been holding. It was a sound of pure pain, the kind that came from deep wounds and broken bones. And it was coming from the direction of the old cottonwood tree that grew near the eastern edge of her property. Miriam's first thought was to run back to the cabin and bar the door. The fire the night before had passed to the south, sparing her land but leaving the air thick with smoke and ash. And now someone was hurt on her property, maybe dying, and she was alone with a baby due any day. But her feet carried her toward the sound instead of away from it. Henry used to say she had healing in her hands, that she couldn't see suffering without trying to help. It was why she'd learned midwifery from the Cherokee woman who used to live by Willow Creek, even though the other settlers whispered that it wasn't proper for a white woman to learn medicine from Indians. The man under the cottonwood tree was definitely an Indian. His long black hair was braided with leather and feathers, and his copper skin was marked with tattoos that looked like lightning bolts and arrow points. He wore buckskin pants and a vest, but no shirt, and she could see the bullet wound in his side clearly. Blood soaked the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around his torso, and more blood pooled in the dirt beneath him. "Please," he whispered when he saw her approach. His voice was rough with pain and thirst. "Water." Every story she'd ever heard about Indian raids flashed through her mind. Tales of scalped families and burned cabins, of women and children carried off never to be seen again. The territorial conflicts had been getting worse each year, and just last month the Morrison brothers had found their cattle scattered and their fence posts burned. They'd blamed it on Comanche raiders, though no one had actually seen any Indians. But this man wasn't raiding anything. He was bleeding to death under her tree, and his eyes held the same desperate fear she'd seen in Henry's face when the consumption took hold of his lungs. "Don't move," she said, kneeling beside him carefully. Her pregnant belly made it hard to bend over, but she managed to get close enough to examine the wound. The bullet had gone clean through his side, missing his vital organs by what looked like pure luck. But the bleeding was bad, and she could see signs of infection starting around the edges. "You're Comanche," she said, more to herself than to him. He nodded weakly. "Ayana. It means eternal blossom." The name surprised her. She'd expected something fierce and warlike, not something that sounded like poetry. "I'm Miriam. Miriam Blackwood." "The widow woman," he said, and she realized he'd been watching her property, maybe for days. "Your husband. He was a good man. Never shot at us when we crossed his land to reach the river." That sounded like Henry. He'd always said that the land belonged to God, not to any one person, and that decent folks should be able to share it. But hearing that this Indian had known her husband, had maybe even spoken to him, made everything more complicated. "Who shot you?" she asked, using her apron to clean around the wound. The bullet hole was ugly but not fatal if she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. "3 men on horses. They came at me from behind while I was hunting rabbits." His voice was getting weaker, and she could see him fighting to stay conscious. "Said I was trespassing on their land, but I was on the treaty ground. Legal hunting ground." What did these men look like? One had a scar across his left cheek. Yellow hair. The others. He trailed off, his eyes losing focus. Miriam's heart sank. A man with yellow hair and a scar on his left cheek could only be Jake Morrison, the older of the Morrison brothers who owned the big ranch to the north. If Jake Morrison had shot this Indian, it meant trouble for everyone involved. The Morrison brothers had money and influence, and they'd been trying to push the Comanche off their traditional hunting grounds for months. "I need to get you inside," she said, looking around to make sure no one else was coming. "Can you walk?" Ayanna tried to sit up and immediately went pale. "Don't think so." Miriam looked at her cabin, then at the wounded man, then at her own swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, alone on the prairie, and about to bring a bleeding Comanche warrior into her home. If anyone found out, she'd be branded as an Indian sympathizer or worse. The Morrison brothers had friends in the territorial government, and they could make life very difficult for a woman who crossed them. But she thought about Henry, about the way he'd always said that helping people was the most important thing a person could do. And she thought about the baby growing inside her, about the kind of world she wanted her child to grow up in. "I'm going to get a blanket," she said. "We'll drag you inside, and I'll tend to that wound properly." As she struggled to her feet, Ayanna caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Why?" he asked. "Why help me?" Miriam looked down at him, at this man who could be her enemy or her death, and realized she didn't have a good answer. All she knew was that leaving him to die felt wrong in a way that went deeper than fear or common sense. "Because you're hurt," she said simply, "and I know how to heal." But as she walked back toward the cabin to get supplies, she couldn't shake the feeling that helping this man was going to change everything. The question was whether that change would save them both or destroy them completely. "He's burning up with fever," Miriam whispered to herself as she wrung out another cool cloth. 3 days had passed since she dragged Ayanna into her cabin, and his condition kept getting worse instead of better. The infection had spread faster than she'd expected. Red streaks ran up his arm from the bullet wound, and his skin felt hot as a cooking stove. Every few hours, he would start shaking so hard the whole bed would rattle, then fall into a sleep so deep she had to put her ear to his chest to make sure he was still breathing. Miriam had cleaned the wound with whiskey and packed it with clean bandages, but she knew it wasn't enough. The Cherokee woman who'd taught her about healing herbs had moved away 2 years ago, and the closest doctor was in town 20 miles away. Even if she could make the journey in her condition, bringing a wounded Indian to a white doctor would cause more problems than it would solve. "Water," Ayanna mumbled, his eyes still closed. His voice sounded different now, thick and confused like he was talking in his sleep. She held a cup to his lips and helped him drink. Most of the water ran down his chin, but some went into his mouth. It was something, at least. Henry used to say that as long as a person could still swallow, there was hope. "You need to fight this?" she told him, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "I didn't risk everything to save you just so you could give up now." The baby kicked hard inside her belly, reminding her that she had more than one life to worry about. Her back ached constantly now, and she'd started having small pains that came and went like warnings. The doctor had said the baby would come any day, and she was supposed to send for the midwife when the real labor started. But how could she explain why there was a half-naked Indian man in her bed? A sound outside made her freeze. Horses. Multiple horses moving fast toward her cabin. She went to the window and peeked through the curtain, her heart sinking when she saw who was coming. Sheriff Coleman rode in front, his badge catching the morning sun. Behind him came Jake Morrison and 2 other men she didn't recognize. All of them wore guns on their hips, and their faces looked grim and determined. Miriam's mind raced. There was no way to hide Ayanna, no way to explain why her cabin smelled like medicine and sickness. The fever had made him delirious, and he might start talking in Comanche at any moment. If the sheriff found him here, she'd be arrested for harboring a fugitive, or worse. "Miriam Blackwood." Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the yard. "We need to talk to you." She smoothed her dress and walked to the door, trying to look calm even though her hands were shaking. "Good morning, Sheriff. What brings you all the way out here?" "We're looking for a wounded Indian," Jake Morrison said before the sheriff could answer. His scar looked angry in the sunlight, and his yellow hair was dirty under his hat. "Shot him 3 days ago for stealing cattle. Tracked him this direction." "I haven't seen any Indians," Miriam said, which was technically true since Ayanna had been unconscious most of the time. Just me and the baby here. Sheriff Coleman studied her face like he was trying to read her thoughts. Mind if we look around? Won't take but a minute. From inside the cabin came a low groan, barely audible but definitely there. Miriam's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to smile. Of course, Sheriff. Though I should warn you, I've been having some female troubles. The baby's been restless, and I haven't been sleeping well. The men shifted uncomfortably. Most frontier men would rather face a grizzly bear than discuss women's medical issues. Jake Morrison actually took a step backward. Maybe we should just take your word for it, one of the other men said quickly. But Sheriff Coleman wasn't so easily discouraged. Won't hurt to have a quick look. We'll be respectful. Another groan came from the bedroom, louder this time. Miriam felt sweat break out on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Actually, Sheriff, I think I might be starting labor. The pains have been coming stronger all morning. This was a complete lie, but it had the desired effect. All four men backed away from her like she had something contagious. Labor, Sheriff Coleman repeated. Right now. Babies come when they want to come, Miriam said, putting one hand on her belly and wincing like she was in pain. And this one seems to want to come today. Jake Morrison looked frustrated. She's lying. I can smell something in there, something like medicine and you can smell whatever you want from out here. Sheriff Coleman cut him off. I'm not searching a woman's cabin while she's birthing a baby. That's where I draw the line. But the Indian can wait, the sheriff said firmly. If he's as badly wounded as you say, he's not going anywhere fast. We'll come back tomorrow when things are settled. As the men mounted their horses and rode away, Miriam felt her knees go weak with relief. She'd bought herself time, but not much. Tomorrow they'd be back. And by then she needed to figure out what to do with Ayanna. Inside the cabin, she found him awake and staring at the ceiling. His fever had broken sometime during the confrontation, and his eyes were clear for the first time in days. You saved me again, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Miriam replied. They'll be back tomorrow, and I can't pretend to be in labor forever. Ayanna tried to sit up and winced. Then I need to leave tonight. You can barely stand, let alone ride a horse. I'll walk if I have to. His dark eyes met hers. I won't let them hurt you for helping me. Miriam looked at this man who'd been close to death just hours ago, now ready to crawl away into the night to protect her from consequences that were her own choice. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in her chest, something she hadn't felt since Henry died. Nobody's crawling anywhere, she said. We're going to figure this out together. But even as she said the words, she wondered how two people, one pregnant and one wounded, could possibly outsmart armed men who had the law on their side. The sound of horses returning at dawn made Miriam's stomach drop like a stone down a well. She'd hoped Sheriff Coleman would keep his word and wait until the next day. But the hoofbeats outside told a different story. Through the window, she counted 6 riders this time instead of 4. They brought more men, she whispered to Ayanna, who was sitting up in bed despite his weakness. The fever had broken, but he was still pale and moved carefully to avoid reopening his wound. Good, he said, checking the loads in the old revolver she'd found in Henry's trunk. More witnesses when I tell them the truth about what happened. Miriam stared at him. What truth? They'll never believe your word over Jake Morrison's. Maybe not. But some men care about justice more than politics. Ayanna's voice was steady, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. And maybe it's time someone stood up to the Morrison brothers. The voices outside grew louder, and Miriam recognized Sheriff Coleman's commanding tone. But there were other voices too, men she didn't know. One voice surprised her. It sounded educated, official, like someone from back east. Mrs. Blackwood, Sheriff Coleman called out. We have a territorial judge with us today. Judge Harrison from the Capitol. He'd like to speak with you. A judge. That changed everything. Judges had the power to overrule local sheriffs, to demand evidence and testimony. If Jake Morrison had been lying about what happened, a real judge might actually listen to the truth. What do you want to do? Miriam asked Ayanna. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling like he was having a conversation with spirits she couldn't see. My grandfather always said that running from the truth only makes it chase you harder. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. He looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed older than his face. I'm going to tell them what really happened. All of it. Miriam felt the baby shift inside her belly, pressing against her ribs like it was trying to get comfortable for whatever came next. And if they don't believe you, then at least someone will have heard the truth. Sometimes that's all you can do. She helped him get dressed, wincing when she saw how much the movement hurt him. The bullet wound had started healing, but he was still weak from blood loss and fever. If this went badly, he wouldn't be able to run or fight. Before we do this, she said, I need to know something. Why were you really on my land that morning? Ayanna finished buttoning his shirt and looked at her with surprise. I told you, I was hunting rabbits. Rabbits don't usually come this close to homesteads. And you said you'd been watching my property. For the first time since she'd known him, Ayanna looked uncomfortable. My cousin's wife, she's been having trouble with her pregnancy. The Cherokee woman who used to live by Willow Creek. She told our people about you before she moved away. Said you had the gift for helping women birth their babies safely. The words hit Miriam like a physical blow. You were coming to ask for my help? I was trying to work up the courage to approach you. White people don't usually welcome Indians asking for favors, even when it's life or death. Miriam felt tears sting her eyes. While she'd been afraid he might hurt her, he'd been afraid she might refuse to help save his family. The misunderstanding felt tragic and somehow typical of the world they lived in. Mrs. Blackwood. The voice outside was getting impatient. We're not leaving until we speak with you. I'm coming, she called back, then turned to Ayanna. Stay here until I see what kind of men we're dealing with. She opened the door to find 6 men standing in her yard. Sheriff Coleman looked tired and irritated, probably from being dragged out here by political pressure. Jake Morrison stood beside him with his arms crossed, his scarred face set in angry lines. The other 3 men she didn't recognize, but one of them wore a black coat and had the soft hands of someone who'd never done hard labor. Judge Harrison, the man in the black coat said, tipping his hat. I apologize for the early hour, but we have reports of a dangerous fugitive in the area. What kind of reports? Miriam asked. Jake Morrison stepped forward. 3 days ago, a Comanche raider shot at me and my men while we were checking our cattle. We wounded him, but he got away. Sheriff Coleman tracked him to this area. That's interesting, Miriam said carefully, because 3 days ago, I found a wounded man on my property who told me a very different story. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the wind moving through the grass. Judge Harrison's eyebrows went up, and even Sheriff Coleman looked surprised. You have the Indian here? Jake Morrison demanded. I have a man here who was shot while hunting legally on treaty land, Miriam replied. A man who says 3 riders ambushed him from behind and left him to die. She's lying, Jake Morrison snarled. Indians always lie, and the people who help them are entitled to tell their side of the story, Judge Harrison interrupted smoothly. Mrs. Blackwood, would you be willing to let us speak with this man? Miriam looked at the faces surrounding her. Some hostile, some curious, all of them holding her future in their hands. He's inside, but I should warn you, he's still recovering from a serious wound. As she led them toward the cabin, she wondered if she was about to save Ayanna's life or get them both killed. But like he'd said, sometimes all you could do was tell the truth and hope someone was listening. Judge, this man is a liar and a thief. Jake Morrison's voice cracked like a whip as Ayanna stepped into the morning sunlight, moving slowly but with dignity despite his obvious pain. Judge Harrison studied Ayanna with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. The other men shifted nervously, hands resting near their weapons, but the judge remained perfectly still. What's your name, son? Ayanna of the Quahati Band, he replied in clear English. It means eternal blossom in your language. And you claim Jake Morrison shot you without cause? I claim nothing. I will tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself. Ayana's voice carried no anger, just a weariness that seemed older than his years. 3 days ago, I was hunting rabbits near Willow Creek, on land guaranteed to my people by the Medicine Lodge Treaty of last year. Jake Morrison spat in the dirt. Treaties don't mean nothing when Indians start stealing cattle. I have never stolen anything from any white man, Ayana said quietly. But I have been shot by white men who see only what they expect to see. Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable. Jake, you said he was rustling cattle. But if he was hunting rabbits, he's lying. Jake's face had gone red above his scar. You can't trust anything an Indian says. Judge Harrison held up his hand for silence. Mr. Morrison, I've heard your version. Now I'd like to hear his. He turned back to Ayana. Continue. I had killed 2 rabbits and was cleaning them by the creek when 3 riders came up behind me. They didn't call out a warning or ask what I was doing. The first shot hit the tree next to my head. Miriam watched the judge's face carefully. His expression gave nothing away, but she noticed he was paying close attention to every word. I called out that I was hunting legally, showed them the rabbits. But the man with the yellow hair and the scar said it didn't matter. Said all Indians were thieves and they were going to make an example of me. That's a lie. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his hand on his gun. Judge, you're not going to believe this savage over a white man's word, are you? I'm going to listen to all the evidence, Judge Harrison said calmly. Mr. Ayana, you said there were 3 men. Can you describe the others? One was tall and thin with a black mustache. The other was short and fat with no hair on top of his head. They called the yellow-haired man Jake. Sheriff Coleman's eyebrows went up. That sounds like Tom Bradley and Pete Kowalski. They work for the Morrison Ranch. So what if they do? Jake Morrison snapped. That doesn't prove anything. Where are these 2 men now? Judge Harrison asked. Jake hesitated just a moment too long. They're working cattle up north. Convenient, the judge murmured. He turned to Ayana. What happened after they shot you? I ran. The bullet went through my side, but I managed to reach the heavy brush by the creek. They followed for a while, but eventually gave up. I walked all night, trying to get back to my people, but I lost too much blood. And you ended up here. Mrs. Blackwood found me under her cottonwood tree. I thought I was going to die. Judge Harrison looked at Miriam. And you decided to help him, despite the obvious risks. I'm a midwife, Miriam said simply. I help people who are hurt. That's what my husband taught me, and that's what I believe is right. Even though helping an Indian could get you in serious trouble, Miriam felt the baby move inside her. And suddenly she thought about the kind of world she wanted her child to grow up in. Your Honor, my husband used to say that we're all just people trying to get by. Color doesn't change that. Jake Morrison laughed harshly. Pretty words, but this is the real world. Indians raid our ranches, steal our cattle, kill our families. You can't trust them. Funny thing about that, Ayana said, his voice still calm. My wife and unborn child were killed by white soldiers 2 years ago. They said we were trespassing on railroad land, even though my people had hunted there for generations. But I don't blame all white people for what those soldiers did. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving through the grass. Judge Harrison studied each face in turn, then pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need to speak with Tom Bradley and Pete Kowalski. Where exactly are they working cattle? They're up at the north pasture. But I don't see why. Because if this man is telling the truth, then attempted murder has been committed. And if he's lying, then we need to prove it with witnesses. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale under his anger. Judge, you can't seriously be considering taking an Indian's word over mine. I'm considering taking evidence over assumptions, Judge Harrison replied sharply. Mrs. Blackwood, may I examine this man's wound? Miriam nodded, and Ayana carefully unbuttoned his shirt. The bullet hole was clearly visible, surrounded by healing tissue and Miriam's careful stitchwork. Shot from behind, the judge observed. Just like he said. And Mrs. Blackwood, this is good medical work. Where did you learn to treat gunshot wounds? From a Cherokee woman named Singing Bird. She taught me about healing herbs and how to clean wounds properly. Singing Bird, Ayanna said with surprise. She was my grandmother's cousin. She spoke of a white woman who came to learn the old ways of healing. Judge Harrison made a note in his book. Interesting. So you two had a connection even before this incident. We did, Miriam said, though I didn't know it at the time. Jake Morrison was looking more desperate by the minute. Judge, this is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Indians have been stealing cattle in this territory. Someone needs to pay for those losses. You're absolutely right, Judge Harrison agreed. Someone does need to pay. The question is who. He closed his notebook and looked around the group of men. Sheriff Coleman, I want you to ride to the Morrison Ranch and bring back Tom Bradley and Pete Kowalski. We're going to get to the bottom of this right now. Judge, Jake Morrison said, his voice tight with worry. Maybe we don't need to bother those boys. Maybe I was mistaken about what happened. Mistaken? The judge's voice was dangerously quiet. You were mistaken about seeing a man steal cattle? Or mistaken about shooting him? For the first time since Miriam had known of him, Jake Morrison looked truly afraid. And watching his fear, she began to suspect that the truth about what happened by Willow Creek was darker and more complicated than anyone had guessed. There's something you need to know about Jake Morrison, Sheriff Coleman said quietly to Judge Harrison as they waited for the other men to return from the ranch. Something I probably should have mentioned before. The judge raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Miriam and Ayanna sat on her front step, both of them exhausted from the morning's confrontation. Jake Morrison paced back and forth like a caged animal, his face switching between anger and worry every few seconds. Jake's been having money troubles, the sheriff continued in a low voice. Bad investments, gambling debts. Word is he owes some dangerous people back east, and they're not the patient type. What does that have to do with cattle rustling? Well, if cattle were disappearing from his ranch, he could collect insurance money. And if he could blame it on Indians, he might be able to get the territorial government to pay compensation too. Judge Harrison's eyes sharpened. You think he's been stealing his own cattle? I think Jake Morrison is desperate enough to try just about anything to get money. And desperate men do desperate things. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders came into view, but Miriam could see immediately that something was wrong. Tom Bradley and Pete Kowalski rode with their hands tied behind their backs, and the man leading them wore a deputy's badge. Judge Harrison, the deputy called out. These men tried to run when they saw me coming. Found them packing their belongings like they were planning to leave the territory. Jake Morrison's face went white as snow. Boys, what are you doing? I told you to stay put. We ain't taking the blame for your scheme, Jake, Tom Bradley said, his thin face twisted with anger. Not when it means hanging for attempted murder. Shut up, Jake Morrison hissed. But Pete Kowalski was already talking. Judge, we never meant to hurt nobody. Jake told us we were just going to scare the Indian, make him run off so Jake could claim he was rustling cattle. That's a lie, Jake protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Judge Harrison asked mildly. Tom, suppose you tell me what really happened at Willow Creek. Tom Bradley looked at Jake Morrison with disgust. Jake's been selling his own cattle and reporting them stolen. He figured if he could pin some rustling on the Comanche, he could claim even more compensation from the government. So you shot an innocent man to cover up insurance fraud? We weren't supposed to shoot anybody, Pete Kowalski burst out. Jake said we'd just fire some warning shots, make the Indian run away. But when he saw us, Jake panicked and started shooting for real. Sheriff Coleman shook his head in disbelief. Jake, is this true? Jake Morrison looked around at the circle of faces, all of them staring at him with varying degrees of disgust and disappointment. For a moment, Miriam almost felt sorry for him. He looked like a man who'd bet everything on one hand of cards and lost. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said finally. I never meant for anybody to get hurt. I needed the money. So you decided to frame an entire people for your own crimes. Judge Harrison said coldly. Do you have any idea how much damage you could have caused? How many innocent people might have died if this had escalated into a war? Jake Morrison said nothing, but his shoulders sagged like all the fight had gone out of him. Judge, Ayanna spoke for the first time since the other men had arrived. I don't want revenge. I just want the truth to be known. The truth will be known, Judge Harrison assured him, and justice will be done. He turned to Sheriff Coleman. I want Jake Morrison and his men arrested for attempted murder, fraud, and filing false reports. They'll stand trial in the territorial court. As the sheriff and his deputy led the 3 men away in chains, Miriam felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been done, but it felt hollow somehow. Too many people had been hurt by one man's greed and desperation. Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Harrison said, I want to thank you for your courage in this matter. Not many people would have risked as much as you did to help a stranger. I didn't do anything special, Miriam replied. I just did what I thought was right. That's exactly what makes it special. The judge tipped his hat. If more people had your sense of justice, the world would be a better place. After the judge and his men rode away, Miriam and Ayanna sat in comfortable silence on her front step. The morning had been exhausting, but there was peace in the quiet that followed the storm. What will you do now? Miriam asked. Go back to my people. Tell them what happened. Make sure they know there are still white people who believe in fairness. Ayanna paused. And I'll bring my cousin's wife here when her time comes, if you'll have her. Miriam smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in months. I'd be honored to help her. The baby kicked inside her belly, and she put her hand over the spot where tiny feet pressed against her ribs. Soon she would have her own child to worry about, her own future to build. But sitting here with this man who had become an unexpected friend, she felt hopeful about that future for the first time since Henry died. Ayanna, she said, what your grandfather said about truth chasing you if you run from it, do you think he was right? I think truth has a way of finding people who are brave enough to face it, he replied. And I think you're one of those people. Looking out at the endless prairie, with its promise of new beginnings and second chances, Miriam thought maybe he was right. Maybe courage was something you found when you needed it most, and maybe the truth really could set you free. The pain that ripped through Miriam's belly 2 weeks later felt like lightning splitting her in half. She gripped the kitchen table so hard her knuckles turned white, gasping as the contraction seized her body like a giant fist. It's time, she whispered to the empty cabin, then louder, it's time. But there was no one to hear her. Ayanna had returned to his people 5 days ago, promising to come back with his cousin's wife when her own baby was ready to be born. The midwife from town was 20 miles away, and even if Miriam could get word to her, the woman might not come in time. Another contraction hit, stronger than the first, and Miriam doubled over with a cry that echoed off the cabin walls. The pain was different from anything she'd felt before, deeper, more urgent, like her body was trying to turn itself inside out. She managed to stumble to the bedroom, where she'd prepared clean sheets and towels weeks ago. Henry's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, telling her to stay calm, to remember what the Cherokee woman had taught her about birthing. But it was different when it was your own body, your own baby fighting to enter the world. Please, she gasped to whatever spirits might be listening. Let my baby be healthy. Let us both live through this. The contractions were coming faster now, with barely a minute between them. Miriam had helped dozens of women give birth, but she'd never been completely alone for a delivery. There was always someone to boil water, to hold the mother's hand, to cut the cord when the baby came. A sound outside made her freeze between pains. Horses again, but moving slowly this time. Through the window, she saw 3 riders approaching, and her heart leaped with relief when she recognized the leader. Ayanna sat tall in his saddle, looking stronger than he had since the shooting. Behind him rode a woman about Miriam's age with kind eyes and gentle hands, and an older man whose weathered face spoke of wisdom earned through long years. Miriam, Ayanna called out as they dismounted. We came as soon as we could. The baby's coming, Miriam called back, then groaned as another contraction gripped her. Now! The woman rushed into the cabin first, her movements quick and confident. She wore traditional Comanche dress but spoke perfect English. I'm Nayeli, Ayana's cousin's wife. I've birthed many babies, including my own twins last month. And I'm Medicine Crow, the older man said, following behind with a leather bag that smelled of herbs and smoke. I help when the spirits of birth need guidance. Miriam felt tears of relief running down her face. She wasn't alone anymore. These people had come to help her, just as she had helped Ayana. How long have the pains been coming? Nayeli asked, helping Miriam onto the bed. 2 hours, maybe 3. They're getting stronger. Good. That means your baby is ready to meet the world. Nayeli's hands were gentle but sure as she examined Miriam. Everything feels normal. Strong baby, good position. Medicine Crow began unpacking herbs from his bag, mixing them with water from Miriam's well. The smell that rose from his bowl was earthy and clean, like sage and sweetgrass and something else she couldn't name. This will help with the pain, he explained, offering her the cup. And this will give you strength for the work ahead. Miriam drank without hesitation. These people had traveled many miles to help her, just as she had helped one of their own. There was a rightness to it that felt like completing a circle. For the next several hours, the three of them worked together like they'd known each other for years. Nayeli guided Miriam through the contractions, showing her how to breathe and when to push. Medicine Crow chanted softly in Comanche, his voice rising and falling like wind through grass. And Ayana stayed close but out of the way, ready to help with whatever was needed. I can see the baby's head, Nayeli announced during one of the final pushes. Dark hair, lots of it. Miriam bore down with everything she had left, feeling her daughter slip into the world with a rush of water and relief. The baby's first cry was strong and healthy, filling the cabin with the sound of new life. A girl, Nayeli said, wrapping the tiny bundle in clean blankets. Perfect and beautiful. Medicine Crow cut the cord with a sharp knife, then began his gentle chanting again. I sing her into the world, he explained to Miriam, so the spirits will know she is welcome here. When Nayeli placed the baby in Miriam's arms, everything else faded away. Her daughter was perfect, tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength, dark eyes that seemed to look right into her soul, and that wonderful baby smell that was like nothing else in the world. What will you name her? Anna asked. Miriam looked at the three people who had helped bring her daughter safely into the world. People she might have feared just a month ago, who had become her friends and helpers in her greatest moment of need. Hope, she said finally. Her name is Hope. Hope, Medicine Crow repeated, nodding approval. A good name, a name that speaks of better days coming. As night fell over the Nebraska territory, Miriam held her daughter close and listened to her new friends prepare food and speak quietly among themselves. For the first time since Henry died, she felt like she belonged to something bigger than her own grief and fear. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars, full of promise and possibility. And inside the warm cabin, for people from 2 different worlds had come together to welcome a new life that would grow up knowing that friendship could cross any boundary. But even in that moment of perfect peace, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles weren't over yet. Hope was born into a world where people like Jake Morrison still existed, where fear and hatred could turn neighbors into enemies. Keeping her daughter safe would require more than love. It would require the same kind of courage that had led her to save a dying stranger under her cottonwood tree. 3 months later, the town of Cedar Falls buzzed with gossip about the widow woman who'd befriended Indians and given birth with their help. Most of the talk was curious rather than hostile, but Miriam could feel the stares whenever she walked down Main Street with Hope in her arms. That's her, she heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to Mrs. Jenkins outside the general store. The one who saved that Indian and caused all the trouble with the Morrison brothers. I heard she let them heathen practices into her home, Mrs. Jenkins whispered back, letting them Indians deliver her baby with their witchcraft. Miriam kept walking, her chin up and her back straight. Let them talk. She knew the truth about what had happened, and that was enough. The bell above the store door chimed as she entered, and conversations stopped like someone had blown out a candle. But Mr. Henderson, the store owner, smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Blackwood, good to see you and little Hope. How are you both doing?" "Very well, thank you." Miriam approached the counter with Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I need supplies for the winter, and I wanted to place an order for some special items." "Of course. What can I get for you?" "Extra blankets, medicine supplies, and food stores. I'm expecting guests this winter." Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Guests? Ayana's cousin is due to have her second baby in December. She'll be staying with me when her time comes, along with anyone else who might need help." The whispers behind her grew louder, but Miriam ignored them. She'd made her decision weeks ago, after much thought and prayer. Her cabin would be a place where anyone could come for help, regardless of the color of their skin. "That's unusual," Mr. Henderson said carefully. "So was a lot of what happened this year," Miriam replied. "But unusual doesn't mean wrong." As she finished her business and prepared to leave, a familiar voice called out behind her. "Mrs. Blackwood?" "Mrs. Miriam Blackwood." She turned to see a well-dressed man in a black coat and hat standing near the door. He looked official, like a government man or a lawyer. "I'm Miriam Blackwood. Charles Wright from the Territorial Hospital Association. I've been hearing about your medical work in the area." The store had gone completely quiet now. Everyone was listening, waiting to see what this city man wanted with the local widow. "I do some midwifery," Miriam said cautiously. "Nothing fancy. From what I hear, you saved a man's life with some very skilled medical care. And you've been trained in both white and Indian healing methods. I learned from whoever was willing to teach me." Mr. Wright smiled. "That's exactly what we're looking for. The territorial government is starting a new program to bring medical care to remote areas. We need people who can work with different communities, who understand that healing comes in many forms." Miriam stared at him. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to make a real difference. The position comes with official recognition, a salary, and supplies. You'd be responsible for a large area, but you'd have the backing of the territorial government." The baby stirred in her arms, and Miriam looked down at Hope's peaceful face. Taking such a position would mean more travel, more responsibility, but also more opportunities to help people who needed it. "There's one condition," she said finally. "What's that?" "I work with everyone who needs help. White, Indian, Mexican, doesn't matter. And I use whatever healing methods work best, whether they come from medical books or traditional knowledge." Mr. Wright nodded. "That's exactly what we're hoping for. The old ways of keeping communities separate aren't working. We need people who can bridge those gaps." From the corner of her eye, Miriam saw Mrs. Patterson's shocked face and Mrs. Jenkins' disapproving frown. But she also saw Mr. Henderson's encouraging nod and the curious, hopeful looks on some of the younger faces. "When would I start?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready. Though I understand you have some guests coming this winter?" Miriam smiled. "Actually, that sounds like the perfect way to begin." As they worked out the details of her new position, Miriam felt something she hadn't experienced since Henry died. A sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving day to day. She would be more than just a widow raising a child alone. She would be a healer, a bridge between worlds, a woman who proved that courage and compassion could change things for the better. When Mr. Wright left, promising to send the official papers within the week, Miriam found herself surrounded by curious townspeople with questions and comments. "Are you really going to let Indians come to your cabin?" young Mary Sullivan asked. "I'm going to help anyone who needs help," Miriam replied. "Just like I hope someone would help me if I needed it. But what if there's trouble? What if people don't like it?" Miriam looked around at the faces surrounding her, some worried, some excited, some disapproving. These were her neighbors, people she'd known for years. But some of them were also the same people who would have let Ayana die under her tree without a second thought. "Then I guess we'll deal with that trouble when it comes," she said. "But I'm not going to stop helping people because of what might happen." As she walked home with Hope sleeping in her arms, Miriam thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened widow counting the days until her baby came. Now she was a woman with a purpose, a future, and friends who would stand by her no matter what challenges lay ahead. The cottonwood tree where she'd first found Ayanna was turning gold with autumn colors, its leaves dancing in the prairie wind. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, were people who might need her help, people who were counting on someone like her to care more about healing than about the color of skin or the language of prayers. Hope made a small sound in her sleep, and Miriam looked down at her daughter's perfect face. This was the world Hope would grow up in, a world where her mother had chosen courage over fear, compassion over prejudice. It wouldn't be an easy world, but it would be a better one than the world Miriam had inherited. And that, she thought, was the most important kind of healing of all. The blizzard that hit the Nebraska Territory in February of 1868 was the worst anyone could remember, with snow piling up past the windows and wind that howled like angry spirits. But inside Miriam's cabin, warmth and hope filled every corner as she knelt beside the bed where Nayeli labored to bring her second child into the world. "The baby's not coming right," Nayeli gasped between contractions, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Something's wrong." Miriam's hands moved gently but confidently as she examined her friend. 3 days of difficult labor had left Nayeli weak, and the baby seemed stuck in a position that made delivery nearly impossible. In town, this would mean calling for the doctor, but the storm had cut them off from the outside world completely. "The baby's turned sideways," Miriam explained to Ayanna, who paced near the window like a caged wolf. "I need to try to turn it from the outside." Medicine Crow looked up from where he'd been chanting softly, his weathered face creased with worry. "This is dangerous medicine. In the old days, we sometimes lost both mother and child when the spirits tangled the birth path." "We're not going to lose anyone," Miriam said with more confidence than she felt. "I've seen this before, and I know what to do." But the truth was, she'd only seen this once, when the Cherokee woman had shown her the technique on a mare having trouble foaling. She'd never tried it on a human mother, and certainly never when lives hung in the balance during a blizzard with no help for miles. Hope slept peacefully in her wooden cradle near the fire, now 5 months old and growing stronger every day. Sometimes Miriam caught herself looking at her daughter and marveling at how much had changed since that terrible day when she'd found Ayanna bleeding under her tree. Now her cabin was full of friends who'd become family, and she was about to attempt the most challenging medical procedure of her life. "Nayeli, I need you to trust me," Miriam said, warming her hands near the fire. "This is going to hurt, but I have to try to move the baby into the right position." Nayeli nodded weakly. "Do whatever you must. I trust you with both our lives." The next few minutes felt like hours as Miriam used everything the Cherokee woman had taught her about feeling for the baby's position and gently coaxing it to turn. Nayeli bit down on a leather strip to keep from screaming, and Ayanna held her hand so tightly his knuckles went white. "There," Miriam breathed as she felt the baby shift. "I think, yes, the head is down now." The next contraction brought visible progress, and Nayeli's face filled with new hope and determination. Medicine Crow's chanting grew stronger, his voice weaving through the cabin like a prayer made of music. "Push now," Miriam encouraged. "Your son is ready to be born." 20 minutes later, a healthy baby boy entered the world with a cry that seemed to shake the very walls. Medicine Crow laughed with joy and relief, and Ayanna wiped tears from his eyes as he looked at his new nephew. "You saved them both," he said to Miriam as she cleaned the baby and checked to make sure Nayeli was all right. "We all saved them," Miriam corrected. "Medicine Crow's prayers, your strength, Nayeli's courage. It took all of us." As the storm raged outside, the 4 adults and 2 babies settled in for what would be several more days trapped together. But instead of feeling crowded or stressed, Miriam found herself treasuring every moment. This was what family felt like. Not just people related by blood, but people who chose to care for each other through the hardest times. "What will you name him?" Miriam asked Nayeli as the new mother nursed her son. Ayanna suggested Courage in Storm. Nayeli replied with a smile. "But I think I'll call him James Courage, a name that works in both our worlds." Medicine Crow nodded approvingly. "A bridge name. Good." This boy will need to walk between worlds, just like his parents. The old man's words proved more prophetic than any of them realized. Over the following months, as word spread about the successful birth during the blizzard, people from all over the territory began seeking out Miriam's help. Some came from white settlements where the doctors were too far away or too expensive. Others came from Indian camps where traditional healers needed someone who understood both old and new ways of medicine. Her cabin became a gathering place where different worlds met and mixed, where a white widow and a Comanche family could work together to save lives and build understanding. The territorial government noticed too, sending her official recognition and supplies, along with requests to help train other healers in frontier medicine. "You've started something important here?" Ayanna told her one evening as they watched Hope and little James playing together on a blanket near the fire. "Something that could change how people see each other." "I just helped a friend," Miriam replied. "The same way you and your family helped me." "But that's exactly the point," Medicine Crow said from his seat near the window. "When people help each other across the lines that divide them, those lines start to fade. Your cabin is proof that different peoples can live together in peace." Looking around at her friends and their children, Miriam felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal happiness. She'd found her purpose in life, and it was bigger than just surviving or even just healing individual people. She was helping to heal the broken places between communities, showing that understanding and respect could overcome fear and prejudice. The baby James gurgled happily as Hope reached for his tiny hand, and Miriam smiled at the sight of the two children playing together without any awareness of the differences that might have kept their parents apart in another time or place. "They'll grow up knowing that friendship is possible," she said. "And maybe they'll teach their children the same thing." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars, vast and full of possibility. And inside the warm cabin, two families from different worlds had become one, bound together by the simple truth that helping each other was the most important thing people could do. Spring arrived early in 1869, painting the Nebraska territory green and gold as Miriam stood in her doorway, watching Hope take her first wobbly steps across the cabin floor. At 14 months old, her daughter was fearless and determined, reaching always for whatever seemed just beyond her grasp. Just like her mother, Ayanna observed with a laugh as Hope tumbled down and immediately pushed herself back up to try again. The past year had transformed Miriam's life in ways she never could have imagined. Her cabin had become a recognized medical station, officially supported by the territorial government and trusted by communities throughout the region. White settlers, Comanche families, Mexican traders, and freed slaves all came to her door seeking help, and somehow she'd managed to help most of them. But success had brought new challenges. Some people in town still whispered about her Indian friends, and there were those who thought a woman shouldn't be practicing medicine at all. The new territorial legislature was debating laws that would require all healers to have formal education from back east, which could end her career before it really began. "Mrs. Blackwood," a familiar voice called from outside. "May I speak with you?" Judge Harrison stood in her yard, looking older than when she'd first met him but still carrying himself with dignity and authority. Behind him stood a woman Miriam didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of someone used to being listened to. "Judge Harrison," Miriam said, stepping outside with Hope in her arms. "What brings you all the way out here?" "I'd like you to meet Dr. Elizabeth Manning," the judge said. "She's here from the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia." Miriam's heart sank. She'd heard rumors that Eastern doctors were being sent west to standardize medical care, which usually meant pushing out anyone who hadn't learned healing in a formal school. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Manning said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work here." "I just help people who need it," Miriam replied cautiously. "From what Judge Harrison tells me, you've saved dozens of lives using a combination of traditional techniques and innovative approaches. That's exactly what we need more of on the frontier." Dr. Manning reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "I'm here to offer you something that's never been offered to a frontier healer before. The Women's Medical College wants to create a special program for experienced healers like yourself, a way to earn official certification while continuing your work here. Miriam stared at the envelope. I don't understand. You'd study by correspondence, take examinations when traveling doctors come through, and have your practical experience count toward a full medical degree. It would take about 2 years, but at the end, you'd be Dr. Miriam Blackwood, licensed to practice anywhere in the United States. More importantly, Judge Harrison added, you'd be protected from any new laws about unlicensed healers. Your work here could continue and expand. Hope babbled happily in Miriam's arms, reaching for Dr. Manning's shiny brooch. The baby had no idea that this moment might determine the course of both their lives. Why me? Miriam asked. There must be other healers with more experience. There are healers with more formal training, Dr. Manning admitted. But we've never encountered anyone who's successfully bridged cultural divides the way you have. Your patient records show equal success rates across different communities, and your techniques combine the best of multiple medical traditions. Plus, Judge Harrison said with a slight smile, you've proven you can handle difficult situations with grace and courage. The territory needs doctors who won't run at the first sign of trouble. Miriam looked around at the landscape that had become her home, thinking about all the people who depended on her care. Nayeli was pregnant again and would need help with the birth. Medicine Crow's arthritis was getting worse, and he relied on her knowledge of pain-relieving herbs. The Murphy family down the creek had 3 young children who seemed to catch every illness that came through the territory. Would I have to leave here? She asked. Never, Dr. Manning assured her. That's the whole point. The frontier needs doctors who understand frontier life. Your cabin would become an official medical station, with government funding and support. Ayana stepped forward from where he'd been quietly listening. Miriam, this is what you were meant to do. The spirits brought us together so you could become the healer this land needs. Looking at her friend, then at her daughter, then at the horizon where so many people waited for the help only she could provide, Miriam felt the same certainty she'd experienced that morning when she chose to save a dying stranger under her cottonwood tree. I accept, she said. Dr. Manning smiled broadly. Excellent. We'll start with basic anatomy and disease theory, then move into advanced surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge. But we'll also want you to document your traditional healing methods. They might teach us a few things too. As the 2 visitors prepared to leave, Judge Harrison turned back one last time. Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here has been noticed all the way to Washington. You've proven that healing can bring people together instead of driving them apart. After they rode away, Miriam sat on her front step with Hope playing in the grass nearby and Ayana whittling a new toy for little James. The evening air was warm and sweet with the smell of prairie flowers, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear Medicine Crow singing to his grandson. Are you ready to become a doctor? Anna asked. Miriam smiled, watching Hope chase a butterfly with the same determined spirit she'd shown learning to walk. I think I've been becoming a doctor all along. Now I'm just going to make it official. The sun set over the endless prairie, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise. And in the growing darkness, lights began to twinkle from homesteads scattered across the landscape. Lights that represented families who knew that if trouble came, there was someone they could count on. Someone who'd learned that healing wasn't just about mending bodies, but about mending the broken places between people. Someone who'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite the fear. Dr. Miriam Blackwood. It had a nice sound to it,